Ta-da! I want to show you my finished Jethro cardigan. Well, mostly finished. Today I want to tell you all about how I went about finishing my Jethro cardigan using a knitting machine. Hey there, thank you so much for being here today. My name is Felicia from SweetGeorgia, and today I want to tell you about my crocheted cardigan that I've been working on for actually a number of months now. So this pattern is called Jethro. It's a Jethro cardigan. It is made entirely from granny squares, all from crocheted granny squares. The pattern was designed by Tanis at Tanis Fiber Arts. It's actually a mix of two things. There are crocheted granny squares going on here, but there's also knitting here. And so the idea with this cardigan is that you would crochet all of the granny squares, 36 granny squares for my particular size. I made size 3. And then you would join all of your crochet granny squares together to make a back piece and 2 front pieces. And then the pattern tells you to sew up the shoulders and sew up the sides, leaving an opening where you would pick up stitches around, in a round, and knit down to make sleeves. And then for the bottom of the cardigan, you would basically pick up stitches at the bottom edge of your cardigan and then knit 2x2 ribbing all the way down for about 1.5 to 2 inches or so. And then you would basically pick up all the way around the front edges of the cardigan to make your collar, or sort of your where you could put buttonholes if you wanted to. I did not do any buttonholes, but if you wanted to, you could make buttonholes to close up the cardigan. But I sort of intended to wear this open the whole time, so I didn't do any buttonholes at all. But all of these things that I'm showing you, all of the knitted parts that I'm showing you, all of that was done on my knitting machine. It's a Silver Reed LK150 knitting machine, so it's a mid-gauge machine. It's perfect for working with this particular weight of yarn. So to finish this sweater, you absolutely, obviously could use hand knitting. All of the instructions that Tanis provides are for hand knitting. But in my case, because I wanted to finish the sweater a little bit quicker, I was under a little bit of a deadline. I wanted to be able to wear it for the Vogue Knitting Retreat. That was a couple weeks ago. And so I wanted to wear it for that particular event and be able to show it, because it is sort of works in with a lot of sort of teaching ideas, teaching content, working with color, looking at color, how does color work together, all of those kinds of things. So I wanted to have it ready for that event. So yes, I was under a little bit of a time crunch. But normally you could absolutely do all of this work finishing this sweater by hand knitting. But I chose to use that Silver Reed LK150 knitting machine that I have, and it was actually the perfect machine to work with this weight of yarn. So the yarn that I'm using is the SweetGeorgia Superwash DK yarn, and it works perfectly on that mid-gauge machine. But because I haven't had a ton of time working with that machine and this yarn, I had to basically start from scratch and knit a whole bunch of knitting gauge swatches so that I could figure out exactly what settings to use on the machine in order to produce the gauge that I needed to match the pattern gauge. So Tanis had specified in her pattern that for all of the knitted portions, you want to aim for about 22 stitches per 4 inches. That's a really lovely DK weight gauge. And so I needed to be able to reproduce 22 stitches per 4 inches using the machine. And so what I did was I made all these tension swatches, and then I washed them and then measure them and then figure out what are the settings that I need to put on the machine in order to produce that same 22 stitches per 4 inches kind of gauge. So I ended up settling on a stitch setting of 4 for the stitch dial, and then for the yarn mass tension I set that to about 2. So if I was knitting this by hand with knitting needles, I would seam the shoulder closed, and then I would seam the sides, and then I would pick up in the round for the sleeves. But because I was going to hang this on the knitting machine, rather than picking up and knitting around, which you can't really do on my particular flatbed knitting machine, I had to hang it flat. So all I did was I seamed the shoulders first, and I joined the shoulders from the inside. I put the 2 right sides together, then I did a single crochet chain all the way across the top of the shoulder. So that way when you flip it inside out, you wouldn't get that sort of crocheted line that went across the top. It just kind of looks nice and smooth, almost like there's no join happening at all, almost like it was joined like the rest of the sweater. But because I was joining into every single stitch, there's a lot more strength and security in this particular shoulder join. I didn't want to use the same sort of join as you go technique as the rest of the sweater, because you can see the join as you go technique produces kind of a lacy effect. You know, they're really only joined at this point, and this point, and this point. So there isn't the same kind of strength as if you were going to join into every single chain stitch. This provides a lot more stability. So I did that for the top of the shoulder. And then basically looking at her schematic and then measuring exactly how many stitches I would need in order to do the width of the sleeve. I added a couple of extra stitches on the sides of the sleeve just so that I had something to seam into. If you're joining in the round, you don't need extra stitches, obviously, but because I was going to be seaming the sweater with mattress stitch, I needed actually a stitch on each side so that I would have something to seam in between. And so you can see that is where my mattress stitch is. I'm actually quite proud of my mattress stitch. It looks almost seamless on the inside here. So it's all nice and pretty. And we do have a tutorial on how to do mattress stitch if you want to seam your garments as well. So that's a really nice, smooth, seamless, beautiful technique as well. But you can see that's what it looks like on the inside of the sweater. So that's where I have one stitch and one stitch on each side, and then I'm seaming in between those two. And then you can see at the end of my sleeve, I do have 2x2 ribbing. Now, in order to do ribbing on that LK150 machine, there's no ribber attachment. So you have to do all of the ribbing manually. And so what I did was I basically started my ribbing, and then I would take 2 stitches and then take them off the needles, flip the orientation of those 2 stitches, and then those would become my pearls. So everything that was a knit then became a pearl, and then go all the way across this way. So I would do leave 2, and then flip 2, leave 2 as they were, and then flip the orientation of 2 and all the way across one row. So that way I would know that that is the row that I was going to start for ribbing. Then I just zip back and forth. Zipping back and forth, what I'm making is basically stockinette on the machine. So when I finished and I got to the end of my ribbing, I basically took the stitches off the needles and I let the whole thing run all the way down to the bottom where I'd started my ribbing. So I let it run down like 16 rows, one stitch, let it just run all the way down 16 rows. Just let it ladder down. And then using my latch hook, I would just latch it back up in the opposite direction, sort of reorienting it so that what was a knit stitch would then become a purl, and then latch it back up to the top of the needles. One at a time, letting one stitch drop down to the starting row of the ribbing, and then latch it back up, hang it, go to the next one, drop it down, latch it back up, hang it, and then do this all the way across. And then once that was done, then I actually had to take all of the stitches off the machine and I put them onto knitting needles. And the reason why is because the way that I normally bind off on a knitting machine works best with a metal machine like the SK280, or I have a 360. All of those allow me to sort of bind off in a really, really easy way, but I couldn't translate that method to my LK150 sort of plastic bed machine that didn't have those gates in between the stitches. So I just took it off the machine entirely, put it on knitting needles, and then I bound off in pattern. So that is basically that for the sleeves. Knit them flat all the way down, knit the ribbing, and then I was able to seam the sides of my sweater and then do the mattress stitch up the length of the sleeve. So with the sides of the sweater, I did it differently. I decided I wanted the crochet chain to be on the outside of my sweater. So I wanted these nice seams, these nice long reinforced seams. The side seams, I wanted them to have that little bit of a crocheted line to them. I know it's a weird, very specific detail, but that is the crocheted line that I have. And again, it is reinforced, right? Because I'm going into every single stitch and chaining every single stitch together. And so that's producing a nice, really solid seam. So I've done shoulders, seamed, hung it, made sleeves, seamed the side of the sleeves with mattress stitch, seamed the sides of the cardigans, and so then the next part to finish was the bottom hem. So this is the bottom of my cardigan, and it's the same idea. I had to hang this onto the knitting machine, basically taking one stitch and hanging it onto the needle, next stitch hanging it onto the needle, all the way across. But because the LK150 only has 150 needles, I actually had to split this in half. And so I couldn't put the entire width of the cardigan, because the entire width of the cardigan is this. There's no way that I could fit this entire width on the knitting machine. So I had to break it up into halves. So I hung half of the back of the cardigan on the machine, and I knit ribbing in that exact way, basically zipping back and forth about 2 inches and then dropping 2 stitches, latching them back up, dropping a stitch, latching it back up all the way until I finished. And then I took that half off of the machine, left it all on circular needles, and then went back and hung the second half on the machine. And so you can see there's a spot in between where I had to basically try to calculate exactly where to put all of my ribbing, so that I could try to make it 2 by 2 ribbing all the way across. But I miscalculated, and so you can see in the middle of my hem here, I have my 2 by 2 ribbing. I have 2 purls, 2 knits, 2 purls, and then I have 3 knits, 2 purls. And so this section here is where I actually had to seam together the 2 halves of my ribbing for the back cardigan. And I just miscalculated. I just miscalculated where I put the ribbing. So that's why it is the way it is. And then once that was done, then the last thing to do was to do the front edges of the cardigan. So you can see the front edges of the sweater are also very long. There's no way that I could hang this entire thing on the machine either. And so I had to split this one in half as well. So I have from the middle of the back neck all the way down to the bottom edge here is 1/2 that was hung on the machine, and it fit pretty much perfectly on the machine. I had to make sure that there was a few stitches on either side that were not being used, so that way the machine would function properly. But again, I think I did a better job on this side, where you can see here, this is where I seamed it together in the middle of the back neck, and it just so happened that this one was all purls. Yeah, it seems like my join is nicely hidden right into there, so you can barely see it. And so that is basically it, but once you get to the inside, you can see all these little ends that still have to be woven in. And so I managed to weave in probably about half of the squares, and they're all nicely trimmed and everything like that. So you can see here, this is the inside of my cardigan. I have sewn in and trimmed most of these squares, but some of the squares have not been finished yet. And that is because I did not bring any scissors with me to the retreat. So I couldn't finish the cardigan, like the inside of the cardigan, at the retreat. There it is. It is all done, and I absolutely love it. It turned out great. I am so glad that it worked out with the machine. It worked out perfectly. I was finishing off the bind off still at the airport, and then I just wet blocked just the edges at the retreat, like 2 hours before the opening reception. So I just basically wet these edges so that way this part could sort of settle in and relax and stretch out a little bit more. But the rest of it, the blocks were actually blocked when I blocked the front and back pieces, but this front ribbing has not been blocked, and it seems to be doing fine on its own. So yeah, I am so wonderfully pleased with the sweater, so I do want to make another one. Like I said before, I have all these granny squares from a million years ago, and I'm just going to join those together, figuring out how all the colors are going to go, and then I'll make a similar sweater for my daughter, for Nina, and so that'll be really, really fun. And as I do that, I will do a tutorial to show you exactly how I do the joining technique, because that was a revelation, and I loved doing that. So that is it for today. Thank you so much for watching this episode. If you like this cardigan and you want to make something similar, I did make this from the SweetGeorgia Superwash DK and the DK weight mini skeins that we make, also called Party of 5 in the DK weight. And so there was 3 Party of 5s, and 3 full skeins of the superwash DK to make this size 3 cardigan. So absolutely, absolutely love it. Thank you guys so much for being here for this entire series on how to make this sweater, and I hope you guys enjoy making yours too if you choose to make one. Thanks so much for watching. I will see you in the next one. All right, bye for now.